Okay, so thanks for indulging us this morning to present our project to you all. Now we're going to, I suppose, do a session that kind of resonates with what we're talking about this morning, looking at the area of work and broaden things out a little bit. So unlike the program note says, we only have 3 papers. Unfortunately, Ariadne couldn't make it. So this is going to be a shorter session, which is always good, I suppose. We got Mihajla, Brendan, and Julia and Andy. Sorry, Josh and Andy. So we're going to start with Mihajla, who's going to talk about extreme lows followed by extreme highs.
No.
Julia, just give you some warnings about.
Yep, perfect. Okay. Oh. Does that go down a bit? No, I won't touch it. All right, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Stephen, for the opportunity to speak today. It's wonderful, and to meet a lot of colleagues who I seem to only know by Twitter names, so it's nice to actually see a lot of people in person, which is fantastic, and my congratulations as well to the Centre for its launch, and I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we are on today. So the study that I'm presenting on is looking at the impacts within the hospitality industry during COVID-19, predominantly within New South Wales and predominantly small businesses. It is a multi-stakeholder study, so I was speaking to workers, including young people, management, business owners, key informants like trade unions, employer associations, as well as relevant government regulators and agencies. So today's presentation kind of takes us to the broad context of the impact of COVID in the hospitality industry, some of the lessons learned, as well as understanding what have been some of the impacts and lived experiences for young workers. So as just a little bit of context as well, so the study was carried out in 2021, so last year, and really sought to understand at a broad level what has been this impact of COVID within the industry. So how the nature of work and working conditions has changed in response to the pandemic. So my traditional area is in employment relations, as well as understanding the broader sectoral changes and challenges impacting upon the industry. So these are essentially the 3 overarching questions that I had front in mind for the study. So how has the pandemic, as well as the recovery phase, affected workers' experiences in the industry? How did businesses in the industry respond during the pandemic, as well as how businesses may be operating differently post-COVID? We're still understanding what that means, and also how key stakeholders in the industry, including trade unions, employer associations, have also responded. So we know the insights from research and practice have been telling us that the hospitality sector at a global scale was hard hit during the COVID crisis. Very immediate effects are being felt by the industry, and this resonated right through, owner operators, government, consumers, and the general hospitality workforce. And some of the early observations of the impact of the crisis really theorised it as the pandemic being an amplification of existing known problems and issues within the industry, an industry typically defined by precarious and casualised labour, high turnover, reports of underpayment and wage theft, increasing digitalisation and encroachment of platform apps, low job quality, etc., etc., etc. So just a bit of context for who I was speaking to. So I carried out 27 interviews with participants in a semi-structured style. It was an intentional multi-stakeholder perspective. I really wanted to get an idea of what was really happening within the industry. So speaking to workers and managers on the ground in cafes, restaurants and pubs, sort of the traditional sit-down environment, as well as owners, other government, other key informants like unions and industry associations. The exact timing of the study wasn't intentional, but actually added a really interesting dimension to the research and some of the conversations that I was having. But essentially, I really wanted to capture in this study the full COVID experience. So, understanding what was the experience like from that real early days, the February, March 2020, up to the point of the time of my interviews. So, I began interviewing into what was the Delta lockdown in Sydney, if we remember that one, which was from about July 2021. Initially, the Premier came out and said it's just going to be a 2-week lockdown and then everyone's going to go back to work, but ended up lasting over 100 days. So this provided a really interesting picture of the different sort of variations and iterations of the pandemic over many, many months. So with these kind of different iterations, these different phases, I also took an approach in my recruitment strategy to understand businesses who effectively sort of stayed in business over the time of the pandemic. They might have closed for a short period of time, but there was that intent to stay in business. And similarly, also workers who had pretty much stayed in the industry right throughout the pandemic as well. So made that deliberate decision to stay and weren't sort of pushed out into different work either. Just briefly as well, so most interviews took place with workers, owners, managers in venues in New South Wales. As I said, predominantly small business, but a mix of metropolitan, city, suburban locations. In terms of the interview questions, again, fairly varied, but wanted to understand what were the experiences like in those different phases of the lockdown and reopening. What were some of the adjustments to operating models that businesses had to make? What were the impacts in terms of staffing, compliance, financial impact? What was the engagement with customers like? What sort of financial assistance was there for workers and for business? What was the intention to stay in the industry for workers and for owners? Were there any opportunities? Were there any silver linings coming out of the pandemic, as well as understanding what were some of the more enduring industry challenges? So there's kind of a lot within that, and I'm just presenting a bit of a sample of a few of those things today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the business perspective, and then I'm going to talk about the worker perspective as well. So first of all, this conversation around sense-making and resilience, I think, was quite important to the narrative. So this is still a piece that I probably should have published a year ago, but it's been that kind of year. But so I'm still kind of pulling the theoretical threads together as well. But this idea of resilience for businesses, this capacity to either adapt, to assess the situation, to innovate, to cope with disruption. I was speaking to a lot of different employers, and they were saying their capacity to bounce back was extremely questionable. Not all businesses had the same capacity to kind of absorb the effects of the pandemic. But really, in this very early stage of the pandemic, March, April 2020, essentially defined by this period of uncertainty and a period of sense making, just trying to understand what was happening within the situation. There was some optimism at the beginning of, there would be some restrictions to movement, but they would be short and we would get back to business as usual. But there were reduced customers, there was decrease in revenues, this real questioning of whether it was viable to keep operating. And this constant tension that owners and managers felt in the business, this pressure to stay open, to adapt, to keep going at the same time. When the June 2020 restrictions were lifted, employers were saying that it was a period defined by business success. Many venues saying they had never been busier in the time that they had been in operation. They were hiring more staff to keep up with demand, but a lot of the staff shortages and international students leaving meant that a lot of the existing staff had to then fill in those gaps and subsequently feel overworked because of that. So in the thick of the pandemic, there was this real paradox, this feeling of, and pressure of wanting to keep the business open, to get back to normal, but also this fear of the unknown and of, hospitality being a very tactile industry, that fear of spreading the virus around. So this real roller coaster metaphor emerged, as the title of my presentation suggests. So after the initial high of businesses reopening in the sense of going back to normal, businesses then felt like they were in a more severe lockdown in that mid to late 2021 period. I was talking to owners and saying, well, have you sort of learnt some lessons? Have things been different this time around? Pretty much all of them said, look, we've learnt some things, but this time around it's just more challenging, it's more difficult. This quote from one business owner in the Sydney CBD, I think, really demonstrates that, saying, I can't see a way out at the moment. Everyone's morale is just down. Every day we see another business closing. We need more and more help. Can't have 10 minutes? Haven't got my glasses on. Thank you. That's right. And the impact and the response from business wasn't necessarily uniform. So the extent to which a business could be resilient depended on a couple of things. It depended upon the size of the business, the structure of the business, as well as the location of the business within the states. That point we were talking about earlier in terms of geography. And the second quote from an industry association also sort of sums that up. That the smaller venues don't really have the time or the resources to adapt, so they're just trying to keep their businesses alive. So whilst it was pretty much the case that all of the hospitality industries that I spoke to had struggled, or venues struggled, your family-owned businesses, your smaller businesses were less financially protected, less resourced, and more time poor than your larger restaurants or bars and those that are part of chains. A lot of them also felt that the government support did not really consider those geographical differences as well. So when the CBD was effectively shut down, they weren't necessarily provided with the same kind of assistance as other areas. Because I was speaking to businesses as well, I wanted to understand, well, okay, why are you staying in business? What's the situation there? What were they doing to actually adapt? As I said, there was this overwhelming sense from venues that they needed to keep going. They needed to maintain the morale of staff. Maybe they had family ties to the business, or maybe they wanted just to keep the name of the business out there in the public. That any sort of innovations were very small, incremental types of things. A lot of things we heard about, reducing hours or days of operation, scaling back the offerings, owners becoming a lot more hands-on in the business to be reducing some of the costs, as well as shifting to the takeaway model, which had a lot of mixed and varied success. Looking at the experiences of young workers briefly as well. So I also wanted to understand, okay, what was their experience like up until this point in the pandemic? And what was also their motivation, their reason for continuing to stay in the industry during COVID? So in terms of the worker participant profile, for some, hospitality was considered that short-term gig. It was considered to provide financial support alongside their university studies. But for others, for fewer, it was their main career choice. So essentially, there were three main reasons I've seen in the data at the moment of why they wanted to stay in the industry. Firstly, this conversation around skills development that we've been talking about, the extent to which there was a positive working environment, a good relationship with the manager, as well as the financial structures that were in place at the time for those who were lucky enough to access government support, which provided that retention incentive. But skills development was a big one. So really sort of gaining the skills now in order to set them up for their future careers. A huge list of skills on that second quote listed. So customer service, interpersonal problem solving, multitasking, critical thinking, patience, leadership, training others, learning how the business finances operate, communication, confidence. And the first quote as well also goes to this point of, my chances of moving out of hospitality are pretty high. I'm not here to work in the industry, but I'm looking at it as an opportunity for the professional work that I want to be going into that's aligned with my studies. And because of the pandemic also, many venues were running with reduced staff. So the ones that stayed on were actually able to upskill. They were able to take on more senior roles or more responsibilities within the business. The second point goes to the fact that it was generally just a good place to work. So those who stayed within the same venue they said that they had experienced positive working relationships with their supervisors and their colleagues, and that management was also actively thinking of ways to keep their staff connected during their period of time working there. So there was this view that, unless a job comes up in my area of study or in my professional interest, I could actually see myself working here for a long time because we do have good relationships with management and with colleagues. The financial story was really interesting, and I know Stephen Threadgold and colleagues have been doing some work in this area as well. So there was, financial support there for those who were lucky enough to access it, but this was also tempered by the stories of those who were unlucky to access some of the financial assistance. So essentially those young workers who literally living at home with their parents, they were okay. They got by during this period of time. And in fact, the financial support actually helped them to focus more intensively on their studies. Some even said the financial support was too generous. They were making more money not working when the business was closed compared to when they were actively working. I don't think I've got the quote there, but one of them saying, I didn't have that financial pressure. It kind of benefited my university life. Saying that I made money off of JobKeeper. But this was also countered by these stories of disadvantage. Others who needed to find work opportunities during lockdown, talking about their other friends who worked in other areas, and then when their hospitality gig reactivated, they felt even more fatigued because they had to kind of go back into do that kind of work. And also a point that was mentioned this morning about, really highly skilled hospitality workers going and doing fairly menial work outside of their hospitality gig. So I just got a couple of slides left. So one other thing as well that I wanted to unpick in these conversations with workers was, what is the appetite like to work in the industry now? Is this an industry that is seen as having any sort of incentive for young workers, or are young workers starting to think differently about the industry? Overwhelmingly, the sort of, to use the word vibe, the vibe around the staffing trends seemed to be business as usual, seemed to be that the issue around staffing will be the same or will likely get worse, and that staffing and recruitment will continue to be a challenge within the future. A lot of workers saying that the pandemic has really put a spotlight on hospitality as being an industry that's unstable, that's full of too much risk, and is also really demanding. And that at the end of the day, it's an in-person job, and we've got this huge conversation at the moment around flexible work and working from home. So there sort of seems to be this enduring stigma about the industry because of the pandemic. So any kind of silver linings, they were pretty brief, to be honest. There was some opportunity to reflect upon existing business practices, maybe do things differently, maybe try and do things more efficiently. Some businesses were able to start their online presence or to strengthen their online presence. Some were able to engage more closely with their local communities, mostly in the suburban areas. And there was that opportunity to develop more close relationships between staff and management as well. But there are a lot of enduring problems. There sort of seems to be this perception that came through in the data that hospitality is this place to earn some income, earn some skills, but it's a short-term gig. It's not considered to be a long-term career path. Many people questioning, working in hospitality in the future due to the instability that was really shown during the pandemic. It's not a job that can be done at home. Recruitment, retention will continue to be an issue within the future, and that those who really stay in the industry will be those who have the passion, those who actually really want to work in the industry for a specific set of reasons. But people will really think twice before opening up their own cafe or their own restaurant. And this quote at the bottom, again, I think really exemplifies it. I can't do this for the rest of my life. Mentally, physically, puts a toll on my body, as Stephen was mentioning. It's long hours. For small businesses, it's very difficult. No one wants to do this kind of work anymore. And just finally, so participants were also saying that it's likely to be an industry in the future that will be consolidated. The size of the industry will shrink. I haven't actually looked at that in the figures yet, but that was the perception of what it would be. There'd be a lot fewer small and independent businesses, and the ones that would continue to exist would be your larger, your larger franchises, your larger chain restaurants as well. And finally, again, that point about professionalising the industry also came up as well, that more needs to be done to show hospitality as a viable career choice. It is an area where you can actually develop those skills, but what can we do to not just take them away to another profession as well? So I'll wrap it up there. Thank you. Oh, microphones.
Okay. I've got ask questions.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I'm curious about whether there was a kind of politics to which workers were kept on or which workers kind of came back when they started to open again, and I'm particularly interested in whether that maybe had anything to do with visa status, ability to access job keeper, and I suppose I'm interested in that kind of dynamic of through this kind of process, who was maintained in the employment relationship, who was kind of excluded or moved out of that relationship.
It's a really good question, Julie. Great question, Julia. So in terms of who was kind of kept within the employment relationship and who was sort of let go as well, a couple of things. What I sort of recall from the data is that the owners of the business did want to kind of actively keep their high-performing staff, which does make sense. But there was also some dynamic in terms of how the financial assistance was being provided to businesses from the government, in terms that they actually had to kind of keep their workers on staff and on the books in order to access the money from the government. So there was this question of like, actually, this could be the opportunity to get rid of a couple of staff members who I don't really want to be there. But there was also that kind of power dynamic at the same time that they actually had to keep some staff where they sort of thought, okay, this would be the time to get rid of them, to sort of move them on as well. But that didn't really eventuate as much in the sample that I was looking at. But yeah, that's a point I didn't mention, but yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks. Really interesting. Can you just clarify the push to professionalise the industry? Was that coming across the board, or was it coming more from workers and less from owners and managers and more from the industry bodies?
Yeah, so it was, it's a great question as well. It was mostly from the unions that I was speaking to, as well as from the industry associations that I was speaking to as well, who were kind of pushing that narrative of this is an industry that we do need to be professionalising. I'm just trying to think of workers, but I don't think... Like, I think definitely that the sentiment among workers was not a view of, I want to be staying within the industry, but I see the potential of working in hospitality for this variety of skills that I can actually garner as part of the job and really exploit that potential while they are here and then move into their different professional line of work attached with their university studies. So that narrative, if I'm recalling correctly, was more from the unions, more from the industry associations that I was speaking to, and not actually from the workers, which is, interesting. Yeah.
Thanks for your paper, that's really interesting. Some of the examples that listed out to me were around the demands of the labour, the physical bodily tolls, things like that being really in plain view. It's interesting that it's coming from the owner and manager, so it's the process on the screen. Yeah. And I mean, some of the stuff we've been doing in our work as well is about how hospitality labour is so poorly remunerated and, it's, not highly rewarded in any sense at all, really. So, I guess I'm just interested in hearing your thoughts about whether owners and managers kind of reflected on that kind of poorly remunerated physical toll they have to take, the workers have to take without sort of having any benefit of owning a business. Do they see that tension? How do they kind of resolve that for their workers if they're all in the same boat? Yeah, absolutely. A couple of things I can mention there, but it was interesting. I was asking participants about the issues to do with wages, for example, and particularly in the IR environment, you hear a lot about underpayment, a lot about wage theft and things like that. Wages wasn't an issue that came up a lot in the data, but I did hear from trade unions, worker organisations saying, I was trying to understand from them, okay, what are the issues that workers are coming to you for at this period of time. They were saying it was more to do with issues like unfair dismissal or a little bit about JobKeeper theft or health and safety issues. But they were actually saying that they weren't getting a lot of your traditional underpayment inquiries because the sentiment seemed to be, okay, this isn't the right time to be raising concerns about wages. We're here to really be, we want to be keeping our jobs. We want to keep small businesses sort of going as well. So that was interesting to sort of see that those issues had declined a little bit for them. But within the venues as well, something that I didn't also mention was that kind of physicality of the job and how it changed during the pandemic as well. And having to kind of put on this face of, everything is okay. We're trying to keep the customers happy, trying to keep them satisfied. But actually behind the scenes, we're going through a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. We're extremely fearful. We don't want to be on the news as there were isolated cases, if we remember, of organisations being on the news, being exposed, hearing a lot about police coming around and doing checks of organisations as well. So this sort of notion of for young people as well, that's a very difficult ask to actually do, to kind of put on that brave face, to kind of show to customers that things are okay, but at the same time having that
anxiety in the background, that sort of emotion at the same time. So, yeah. Thank you.
One more.
Thanks for your help. This is really interesting. Obviously, there's strong links to what we're doing in our work with hospitality workers. I'm going back to this note on professionalisation. I'd like to hear if any of your the people that you spoke to had suggestions for what professionalisation in the industry would look like, because there are courses you can take. There are business management, but also in skill building. But how does that look like in comparison to the recognition of skill or structural change in hospitality?
Yeah. Probably a really good question, but one that I probably can't actually answer. So I didn't sort of go to that next line of questioning and saying, okay, what are the steps with which we can actually do this in practice? I think it must have just been the nature of the sample itself, that I was speaking to those workers who were just sort of seeing it as that short-term gig of how can I sort of exploit the potential of the industry, and then when a job comes up within my relevant field of my interest, that's the transition that I'm going to be making. So that's a great point. How do you actually sort of do that within practice? What are the steps to do that? I think there's quite a long way to go, is my sort of view there. Yeah.
I'd just like to point out too that we've got some data of workers imagining kind of the end of the decline of the hospitality industry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to
Link up.
see like the opposite.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Thank you.
Brendan.
Shall I wait for Steve so he can hear my brilliant presentation, or should I just? I don't know. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and pay my respects to elders past and present. I was going to thank Steve, but I'll just thank you, Dave, for the invitation to coming to speak here today. It's a real pleasure just to be sitting with like-minded colleagues, talking about young people in the new economy, which is something that's very I was going to say dear to my heart, but that's too strong a words. It's something that I care about deeply and are awake at night thinking about. I'd also like to just say that congratulations to you guys on the centre. There are lots of youth study centres around the country. I think there's a collective at my own university. There are cabals and cliques at other universities. But you guys, I always look to you and I think what innovative work you're doing. And the highest compliment I can give you is that I often see it and go, damn, I wish I was doing that. So congratulations to you guys. Today I am going to speak about some findings from my DECA. In the program it'll say I'm doing health and wellbeing, but I did that last week, and so never wanting to repeat myself, I'm going to do something just a little bit more broader about what youth underemployment looks like, and trying to tease that out and look at some of the things that young people do. Oh damn, I was going to time myself. So that's what I'm doing today. So the transitions paradigm, which I talked about last week, really underpins so much of what we think about young people's labour market participation and underemployment. Young people should either be learning or earning, our infamous former Treasurer Joe Hockey said, and before him actually Keating earlier in the 1990s, said that young people need to be in education, employment or training. There was no kind of other, which is kind of problematic for underemployment because it's kind of in the middle of all of that. And youth underemployment is kind of rendered invisible. We don't really we know it's a problem. We say youth underemployment. We bandy around that, oh, we've got to do something about this. But we really don't know what youth underemployment looks like for young people. We know how much there is, and we kind of slightly know who is likely to be underemployed. But again, we really don't know what underemployment looks like every day for young people. And so that's what I'm trying to do today. Just broadly, for anyone who doesn't know what underemployment is, in its broadest definition, it's working below one's capacity. Economists will probably have issue with my definition, but I like the kind of broad definition because it can encapsulate lots of things. It could be talking about skills mismatch. It could be talking about the fact that you're in a job now that you get paid less than the job before. Today, I'm really just focusing on young people who want more hours. They could be in full-time work or part-time work. The ABS really only looks at it in terms of part-time work. But as I kind of talked about on Friday, and it's something that I'm going to keep going on about, is that youth underemployment is also a problem for people who are in full-time work. They want more hours, and I'm about to show you how many more hours full-time workers want. We're kind of not looking at the problem as a whole if we just focus on part-time work, because there are actually a lot of jobs that young people are in that are full-time but are shit. They don't pay well, they have poor conditions, they're stressful. So we need to actually put the full-time back into the picture in order to get a better sense of what's going on. So what are the contours of underemployment? What does it look like? This is a graph taken from Hilda. This is the only stats you're going to see from me today. It's all qualitative, as I keep banging on about. I'm a qual researcher. And so this comes from the Household Income Labour Dynamics in Australia survey, the Hilda survey, Megan. And this is how many hours they're currently working their job and how many hours they would like to work for men and women in full-time and part-time work. So you can see that actually men want about 11 hours more if, 11 hours more if they're in full-time work. If they're in part-time work, they want 14, 15 hours more a week, okay? I'm trying to do the sums in my head, so it will be a bit rough here. For women, they want about 10 more hours too if they're in full-time work, and if they are part-time employed, they want about 13.5, okay? So people at least want at least an extra day's worth of work than they currently work at the moment. And so I want to try and think through what is underemployment, and going off what Dave said to me on Friday, trying to think about underemployment in a kind of more theoretical way, and some conversations that he and I had earlier. I'm kind of drawing on the work of Lisa Adkins, and I'm really trying to test this out. I'm not sold on it, and so I'd like your feedback if you've got it to see if this actually flies. So Lisa Adkins talks about the current state of affairs for work, and she says that capital seeks not a social contract with labour, but a contingent and provisional contract. A contract where nothing is guaranteed for the worker or would-be worker other than the hope or possibility of work, but not necessarily a sustaining wage or a life that can be planned into the future. And as a part of this kind of take on the kind of post-Fordist economy, she says that there's been this blurring of lines between employment and underemployment. They're no longer oppositional, okay? They're more like on a continuum. They're closer and close. They look closer and closer together. Like, it's hard to distinguish them anymore. And in this way, both... Oh, shut up. Siri. Both of them want people to be producing value, to be doing things. And so in this way, unemployment becomes eventful, and it involves activities like looking for work, job training, mutual obligation, which kind of makes sure that workers are always kind of doing something productive, that they're ready for their next job, or that they should be a labour force in waiting, okay? So at some point, they'll be ready to go. Unemployment is no longer time away from work, but is work. It involves all these other things that actually are work, okay? And it's also time spent thinking about work. And so against this background of trying to think about unemployment and employment, I'm trying to think about whether underemployment is in the middle somewhere in how that might be. So I'm also going to argue that underemployment is similarly eventful like employment and unemployment. Young underemployed people spend a lot of time doing work-like activities even when they're not working. They spend a lot of time waiting for work, okay? And so I'm going to draw on some qualitative data that I've just collected recently to unpack some of that stuff. So this comes from some data that I've just done in October and November. It's 27 interviews with some young people aged between 18 and 34. I collected this qual data using a survey. So I put it on Facebook and some various other places and just asked young people to opt in if they thought they were underemployed. So they filled out a short demographic survey. I went through it, contacted them and asked them for an interview. The sample is largely white women, 2/3 are women. The average age is 28. There are small percentage, well, not small percentages, but about 20% are non-heterosexual, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, 20% are born overseas, which might be a bit of a problem, and perhaps I need to do some further recruitment. They're variously attached or non-attached with a romantic partner. 75% are childless, and interestingly, more than half hold a tertiary qualification. The average number of hours that the participants wanted to work were almost 17 per week, and the number of hours they desired were about 13. So it's kind of in line with the quantitative data in that case. And so now I'm going to go through some slides to kind of show you what young people talk about, the ways in which young people discuss what they do as they're underemployed. What are some of the things that they do? A lot of people in the sample talked about being constantly in a flux over their roster, over their schedule. They were never sure about what was going on in terms of hours. Some people got their shifts on an app. Some people got their roster and it would change the next day. So they were constantly in a state of flux. Ashley, my phone is glued to my hip, waiting for anything that would come through. Whatever that be, a phone call or a text. She works at a school that I similarly frequently use. I wait for some sort of a notification, ask them to come in, and then I make sure that I'm the first one there. So it's also competitive as well. A couple of my participants talked about actually also being competitive with other workers, especially for jobs in which there was an app that they could kind of show their availability. So they were kind of competing for hours. And as Ashley says, I'm fighting potentially with a lot of people that I'm not aware of. And if I'm the first one in, I get to go in. I'll be able to get money and get paid. Mel similarly talks about, having a draft roster that gets built and it kind of gets updated. And so one version she'll kind of have a fair idea of what she's working, and then the next day it'll be completely different. You've got different days, different shifts, and she spends a lot of time trying to organise her life around that. And when I ask her about her availability and schedule control, she said, she wants to make herself fully available for her work. She doesn't want to minimise her kind of availability, because if she does, it might mean that she will lose out on work. And a lot of the participants actually talk about that. So they're desperate to cling to the hours they've got. They don't want to upset their boss. They don't want to piss anyone off. They want to be seen as the good ideal worker who's ready to come in at a drop of a hat. It also can be a bit of a problem for some of the young people in terms of the way their work is scheduled, that they can't do other things or they can't actually get other jobs. So a number of people in my study talked about wanting to have a second job but couldn't. So Luke the zookeeper has difficulty trying to get another job because of the way in which the hours are scheduled. He can't actually do it because the hours are staggered as such that it just wouldn't be possible, and the work's also physically demanding. Taryn is also stuck too, and in this way she kind of has a sense of loyalty too. She is a bit hesitant about saying no to her main employer because she doesn't want to upset him. So she says, I end up getting stuffed around because I don't get enough hours, or the wage isn't great. I'm literally on minimum wage last semester, and I just had a bit of a pay rise. So it's like I have to have work. I have to have work several hours to make something substantial. What makes me really hesitant is to get a proper second job, because my boss says, come summer, this place is going to be so busy, you're not going to be on so much. So it makes me think like, yes, I don't want to commit. So they're kind of in this halfway position where they kind of want something but can't really do it because of the way their current job is demands on them. If they're not looking for if they're not trying to get a second job, they're looking for work. So a lot of the participants, in fact, almost all of them, talk about spending some of their week looking for work. For some of it was daily. They go through Seek, they're on job lists. Ashley talks about it being a frustrating process. She's on casual registers. Beck says that she's got sleepless nights. She's always looking on her phone. Luke, often redoing his resume. And from week to week it can change. Spends a lot of time on job boards, less so when he's having better weeks. Okay, but a lot of them do talk about, you know, devoting a lot of mental energy and also time to getting out of their current situation. They're also readying themselves. So they're trying to make sure that, you know, they have the best chance at getting a better job. Sam constantly thinks about, you know, does he need to upskill himself? Do I need to do software training? He does some stuff online, but he feels like maybe he needs to do something a little bit more formal. Chris wants to do more upskilling in terms of marketing. He thinks that this kind of training will be ideal and is looking for a job that might be able to provide that. Shirley as well, she thinks about training all the time, so that she's ready to leave when the perfect job comes along. So if they're not looking for jobs and they're not getting screwed over by their schedules, they're doing little bits and pieces of what could be considered another job or a side hustle. Broadly, I'm saying it's a secondary economic activity, but they do this to kind of keep going, to survive financially. And Ian talks about the need to be crafty. You have to look out for things to help you. You have to try and work just a little extra. I'm pretty savvy, so I haven't been burnt for them. I'll give you an example. So there's this website, there's this thing I saw which was offering $40 USD for some freelance work for voice training or for AI or some shit. I had to spend multiple hours on that just trying to figure out if they were legit, because it seems weird, but I really need the money. But you always have to be on it. You always have to keep an eye out for it. And that does get a bit tiring after a while. Beck, similarly, she does mystery shopping, you know, so she works as an administrative assistant in the transportation industry, but on the weekends, public holidays, she spends her time with her partner driving around and pretending to buy nice stuff at Harvey Norman. You know, and she often has to kind of, I think this work is kind of given out monthly, and so she often over accepts more work than she's able to possibly do, but she's worried about not working enough. And when I kind of interrogated her and said, is this a financial need? She kind of gave a strange answer to imply that, well, no, not really, because her husband can support her economically, but she's in the habit of doing this. She's always trying to save money or be busy. It was a strange one. And some of them did kind of talk about what you might think of as legitimate side hustles. So Mel is a hospitality worker, and she talks about spending her time doing up old furniture, flipping furniture, and just a new kind of side piece for her. But she thinks about maybe one day this might be a job for her that might be another source of income. It's kind of a bit sporadic at the moment. And she talks about her sister at the end, who is thinking about being a lash technician on the side, just to earn a bit of extra money. And second jobs, just broadly, almost half the sample had a second job, and they talked about this for financial reasons. They needed the money. Sam, I do other work because I don't get enough hours. I do work at the factory, so I work there once or twice a week. Sometimes I don't even get hours there. So 4 minutes. Discussion points. I guess with this presentation, I'm kind of just trying to think about what do young people do, and trying to, perhaps not challenge the idea, but to perhaps get us to think about, well, what does underemployment look like? Is it just one person who probably doesn't get, enough hours and they just sit in that one job? What do they do? And most of the participants in my qualitative sample, they have these fragmented lives. Like their days are broken up by work. They might work 4 hours Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 6 hours on Thursday and Friday, but it's never a full day's worth of work. There is no abundance of leisure time or free time or idleness. They're not sitting there hanging out with their friends. There's this idea amongst the sample that, they're busy, they're chaotic lives, they're always doing something. In the case of Ian, the security guard worker, he's hustling all the time, spending his time online. I mean, I think he kind of estimated that he spends almost full-time work hours looking for things on the internet to supplement his income. And so to kind of, I guess, cap this off, I'm trying to think about, well, these underemployed people seem like this loose labour force. They're contractually contingent. They're a workforce in waiting. They're either waiting for work, looking for work, or kind of readying themselves for the next best opportunity. And there we go.
Thanks, Brendan. You have some questions? There was
I'm ready.
Okay. Good paper, thank you. You were like comments. I think that the framework you set up definitely worked. I think it's useful. To me, I think what you've kind of shown here is that through a focus on unemployment, that the distinction between employment and unemployment is becoming problematic because of the nature of work. Underemployment demonstrates that better than anything else. And you're showing there is no difference between, you can't make a distinction between employed and unemployed, because underemployment resembles both of these things. So also what you're showing is that work subsumes your life more if you are underemployed, as opposed to if you are securely fully employed. Because if you're securely fully employed, then your life is organised into it's that distinction between work and leisure then makes sense to you, but it doesn't to your participants because they're potentially ready to become working again. So I think that's really significant. You should continue to sort of emphasise the continuum that you're kind of looking at. It's actually it's a very significant one. Maybe not that well theorised in a literature that does tend to be posing the relationship between employment and unemployment as a problem, rather than posing underemployment as a terrain where a lot of these tensions are being worked out in a really evocative and visible way. Definitely not a question, but
no, and I guess that's I should probably tie this up a little bit more. It's that part of the problem with thinking about all this stuff in a transitions way. It's like, okay, well, you've got a job, but actually this problem of underemployment in the middle is so messy and murky, and
feel exhausted just thinking about that, right? Like, man, it's so tiring just thinking about those experiences with young people. Like, one knows a young person. There's nothing surprising in there, right? Like, how many decades have we known that being powerless in the workplace is really bad for us, right? And it's so unhealthy to have that little power in work. I know in this study you were looking at underemployment in the definition in terms of hours, but gosh, there was also so much in there about underemployment in terms of the lack of match between skill. That was at 55%.
Yeah.
Most people had uni degrees, and people talking about these side hustles where they're so creative and clever. So are you going to do any more with that other aspect of underemployment?
Yeah, sure. It might be frenetic because I'm a frenetic person. the part of the DECA is to kind of look at a couple of multiple forms of underemployment. And so the goal was next year, at the start of the year, to kind of start looking at, young people and their graduate qualifications and what they do once they graduate, because that's a huge issue, as the Productivity Commission has identified. But it's taken me a while to do this part of it. But also there's something about this that I want to keep pursuing, because I do think that this is the more hidden population and the more vulnerable. But yes, at some point I will hope to get to that.
Okay, thanks, Ben. I was thinking about some of your second jobs that even though that they have had enough work coming in for a partner who is able to support them financially. To what extent do you participants talk about a sense of financial independence?
From other partners or?
For themselves, like did they feel that they were able to gain or have financial independence in their future?
No, they seem to be trapped financially. I mean, Beck was an interesting one. I didn't understand it, and I did interrogate her. I mean, as much as a newbie qualitative researcher can do that without getting aggressive. I try to understand from her perspective what was going on, but she said, I just keep doing this mystery shopping. I keep accepting it. And I probably think that's related to her employment history and this fear of kind of losing her job, or something might go wrong with her partner. But most of the participants in my sample, they talked about just getting by or being financially dependent, which is what caused them to get their second job. The first job just wasn't cutting it. Does that answer what you're talking about? Yep.
That's great. I'm really enjoying the right word. Well, there's a question to you, to none of the papers here as well. My ignorance really. I want to know something about the owners of the businesses. I want to know something about the other side of the equation. So, who are these people working for? They're small businesses, are they corporates? What do these people think they're doing? In terms of just thinking about the issues of conducting extractions, thinking about rethinking those as a social reproduction.
Yeah.
I mean, we're in a post-war system. How can we conceptualise it? These people aren't earning enough to consume. They're spaces of life that they would perhaps in a previous period use for consumption. They're now using to consume mechanisms to work. And so I can't really see how it works in the longer run. It might be a generation effect, but I want to know something about the other side of the equation. The owners of these businesses and companies, probably also facing a whole series of challenges. But they also have families. They also have children who are entering this economy as well. And I just want to know a little bit about the other side of the equation. What's something about the kind of employment structure?
Yeah, sure. And it's funny, I think about the two. And when Julia was talking as well, that I was also thinking about, the employer's responsibility for these young women and what are they thinking about that. But Julia might be able to talk to that because that's her research. But I tried to interrogate stop saying interrogate, like I asked the respondents about this, about approaching their boss for work and trying to understand the kind of culture of what was going on in these organisations. And a lot of them had never asked their boss for more hours because there was this kind of culture, that they knew they couldn't, that it was just impossible, and that actually there was a risk in doing that. Asking for more hours was one of those things that would piss off the employer. And so they thought if they asked for more, they kind of exposed themselves and made them more vulnerable. But I really, that could be my next project, like seeing it from the other side. What do you think you're doing?
I have a question. So all of the examples remind me so much of the kinds of things that people talk to me about in my predicate everyday embodiment, which is about, talking about being what are the circumstances of people's lives, and they talk about the dynamics of employment or underemployment, urbanisation, and just the necessity to be so unfailingly responsive all the time to the demands of their employer or the context structure of their work. So I was just wondering if they talk about we're feeling exhausted listening to it. Do they talk about the kind of well-being? How we describe the kind of implications of the tolls we take
on conditions of their daily lives.
Yeah, on Friday I did talk about wellbeing. There was TASA on Friday, for those who are not familiar in the room, and I talked about young people's health and wellbeing as linked to underemployment. And yeah, a lot of them felt exhausted. You know, things about like working the second job, like they'd get to the end of the week and they'd be so tired from their main job, then they'd go do bar work at night, and then they were so tired they couldn't see their friends. And so, you know, they were tired, but then they were kind of sad about not seeing their friends. It just was this kind of rolling thing of, you know, and worrying about how you're going to pay the bills. And a lot of the quotes kind of showed that, you know, that this worry was so linked to hours, because hours means more money. And so it was just, it was depressing to hear. And once I finished, you know, once I got to 27, I was like, right, I need a holiday just from it, because not that it's about me, but all it is, that they were depleted. Like, I got this sense of they were frustrated about so much of this, that, yeah, and desperate. Does that answer? Yeah.
We've got 2 more questions.
The thing that stood out for me in that was the rostering practices. It sounded like a union ad for work choices, and reminded me of the labour hire practices of the first half of the 20th century rather than, you know, 2022. Surely that's an area where governments and unions and everyone's got to get to work to formalise those so that people can't be screwed around like that.
Yeah. I mean, I was surprised. I mean, it's been forever since I had my retail job, but you go to the board on a Monday and you'd see where your shift is. But the app thing was this new dimension that I just did not see, but also like the competitive nature of it as well. I mean, as you're talking about, the pitting of worker against worker for a 3-hour shift. I mean, the ridiculousness of it all. Like,
Thanks, Brandon. I was surprised looking at the quotes, the ages of the workers that we were speaking to. Kind of on the older side, 28, 29, 30, and I was curious if you sort of knew from your sampling, is this the way of life for these people? I would assume they would have been the labour market. Is this a new, new class of people? Like when I think about unemployment, I'm thinking about really young workers, but these would be people potentially with families, small businesses. Yeah.
The proportion of young people who are like 25 to 34 wanting more hours has grown since the GFC. So, I mean, we shouldn't think about the COVID kind of thing, because at the moment the labour market's quite good, and so underemployment is down. But I assume it will go back to that once we fix our migration system and whatever. But yes, it's becoming becoming more problematic for this group. And a lot of these people, you know, had been to university, but their jobs when they left university were not great. And some of them, you know, continued to work in the casual job that they held during university. And so I'm thinking it's a post-GFC kind of COVID effect. But yeah, it's becoming more prevalent for that age group, which I think is just indicative of how bad the labour market has gotten for young people. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Brendan.
Thank you.
As a newly qualitative researcher, what percentage of your research has to be qualitative if you don't want to be quantitative?
Always got to have a track.
Yeah. Okay, the last paper of the session today is Judge It's next. Just put it on the first.
Thanks, Josh. Hi everyone, I'm Andy Pekarek from Melbourne University. Also want to join others to congratulate the organisers on the launch of the centre. It's really nice to see, and thanks for the opportunity to be here at this launch. It's my first time in Newcastle, so it's a nice occasion to be here. And So I'm really an industrial relations researcher, and it's really great to see so many of you doing research on work, young people and work. So it's really, really encouraged by that, and such interesting perspectives on work as well. So yeah, it's been a really good day so far. So in this paper, I know we've heard some depressing sort of stories about work and how bad it is, and we're going to try and take it to the next level, make you feel even more exhausted and tired about this, because we're going to be talking about work in the gig economy. So this is a paper with Josh and Ari, and this is very much a working paper, just trying to interrogate a new data set that we have. So we just want to share some findings and a few initial ideas. So as we've heard today, and as many of you have documented in your research, there's a raft of problems in the youth labour market. Insecure work, wage theft, underemployment, skills underutilisation, fragmented career paths. It's terrible. And work in the gig economy is, emblematic of these kind of issues. What do I mean by gig economy? So we take that term to mean something specific, and we take the term gig economy to mean work that is performed via digital labour platforms. So people who are working for platforms like Uber or Menulog or Airtasker or DoorDash. Okay, so people who are transacting via platforms to perform work. And young people have a high representation as gig workers. So younger people, those aged 18 to 34, are working through digital platforms in higher proportions than other demographic groups. So it's an important segment of the labour market that sort of working for digital platforms. And in this paper, we're looking at youth attitudes towards gig work as consumers. So a lot of people are looking at gig workers, their experiences as, Uber drivers or food couriers and so on. What we're interested in is how consumers are thinking about the quality of that work. So gig work as consumers, what does that mean? So that means if I'm a consumer of gig work, I use a platform to order a service like a rideshare or a meal or, some household task. So that's the focus for us in this paper. So there's a lot of debate about the future of work and, inequality in the labour market. And the gig economy is kind of like a flashpoint in those debates. So some celebrate the flexibility that supposedly it sort of offers to people that are looking for a bit of extra income, a bit of a side hustle. On the other hand, there's many commentators who sort of, are concerned about the precarity that's associated with gig work, and there's a lot of evidence on that too. And our earlier work, has looked at how these issues are perceived in the general population. So is gig work good or bad, essentially, is the question we're interested in. And what's the logic for looking at this? Public perceptions form the basis of the social license of platforms, and they may also provide fuel opportunity for campaigning, regulation, and so on. So we need to understand how we might raise awareness or shift people's sentiment to build collective support and actions towards improving the work experience of gig workers. So why focus on young people? So we think that young people's views of gig work are likely to reflect an array of factors. And we think that they might tend in one of two directions. So on the one hand, we know that young people face a difficult labour market. We also know that they understand that the labour market is rubbish. Okay, and Josh will talk more about that a little bit later. And as I mentioned, young people also have a high representation amongst gig workers. So they have lived experience, they know these jobs. And most young people probably know someone who, does food delivery or some other sort of gig via platforms. So we think that maybe there's some sort of intra-generational solidarity amongst young people, okay? So they feel some sort of responsibility or shared sense of sort of experience with other young people. So therefore we think on the one hand, they might be more critical of gig work. On the other hand, we also know that young people are heavier users of platform services. So this is associated with more positive use of gig work. That's what our earlier research shows. So young people might recognise that gig work has problems, but choose to ignore that information. There's just this idea of willful ignorance where consumers deliberately overlook negative information about a product or service that they desire. So they try to somehow rationalise the continued use of that problematic product or service. So for these reasons, young people might hold more favourable views of gig work. So it could be that they're more critical or more favourable. Which one of these do you think is more persuasive? Do you think young people will hold more critical views or more positive views? Who thinks more positive views? Can I have a show of hands? Thank you, Brendan. Thank you.
One vote in favour.
Okay, so I love that with students when you're giving a lecture and you ask us and go, who thinks, who's in favour, who's against, and no one puts their hand up. And that's normally what happens. So I feel like, thank you for reminding me about the semester and what it feels like to stand in front of a class. But anyway, so I take it everybody else thinks young people will hold more critical views of gig work. Yes?
Maybe not just hold both critical and favourable views at the same time.
The plot thickens.
That's going to be it.
So, to sort of, I think this is where Josh is going to come in, and
Thanks for the plot spoiler.
yeah, thank you.
Hi everyone. So can I just reiterate, it's really nice to have Andy here with us in Newcastle. He and I have been working on a bunch of things to do with work and gig economy for a while. He did mention that it's his first time here in Newcastle. What he didn't stress is his openness to your suggestions about the best beaches, bars and cultural institutions that he ought to see in his time here. I just want to tell you a little bit about, so that's sort of the framework that we've used, I guess, to set up this paper and motivate this analysis. Just want to tell you a little bit about the data set itself before showing you some of our initial results. So what we're using is data from the Australian Cooperative Election Survey or Study. Every 3 years when we have a federal election, they run this survey. It's a big poll that essentially focuses on eligible Australian voters, people's awareness of political issues that are kind of in the air at the time, information about their voting intentions, a whole barrage of things about who they are, etc. What we've done and what we're kind of, exploiting here for this paper is a module on work that we've kind of piggybacked onto that study. So this was a cooperative endeavour in its own right. Brendan and Leah from the University of Melbourne were involved. Andy and I were involved. Some collaborators from the University of Sydney, and Ariadne and a couple of other people from the ANU. So we put our heads together and kind of developed a relatively short module of questions focusing on work, including on gig work, that we've then sort of bolted on to this larger election survey. So that's the source of the data. Obviously, because of the scope of the study, it's focused on not the entire Australian population, but those that are essentially citizens and eligible to vote, so people 18 years and over. The questionnaires are administered online, so that's the way in which people have participated. The field work was done by YouGov, the polling company, and they did, I think, a pretty good job and were good to work with if anybody's in the market of looking for a survey partner. So what we've got then is I can see just in my peripheral vision, thank you, Julia. So what we've got is a core set of questions. That's the backbone of the study, and then this bespoke module on work that we developed with about 6,000 respondents in total, and then a subset of those 6,000, just over 1,000 respondents who have answered our questions on work. So the two parts together kind of constitute a really nice, pretty rich data set with obviously a lot of information about who the respondents are, their attitudes to a whole variety of things, and also some interesting questions in there about the kinds of political, I guess you would say, or community, social activist types of activities that people might have gotten involved with, joining political movements, signing petitions, doing other things as citizens, but also as consumers that we can sort of potentially use in this study. So that's what we've got, and just for your information, because we're focusing here on youth, so 18 to 34-year-olds, they're about 26% of the total sample, both the full WAC and also our work module. So let's just have a little look at this. So just to remind you of the kind of the dualism that Andy was sort of setting up there, with potentially more critical views on the one hand and more favourable views on the other. This is a set of questions that just look at people's general views about what's going on in the Australian workplace at the moment. And we ask them to what extent they think that certain things are problematic, right, for Australian workers. And what we've presented here is just mean results. So there are going to be just a few numbers to come, just to give you advance warning about that. So what we're looking at here is just essentially the scores and comparing that youth sample with the rest of the sample, right? So the non-young, if you like. And I've highlighted in red here, we've highlighted in red the questions where there's a statistically significant difference between young people and others, right? So, and then the responses have been ranked according to the strength of agreement, if you like. So at the top there are the propositions that young people sort of agree most strongly with. Okay, so you'll see that those scores are closer to 1 because that represents the sort of strongest agreement in this framework. So what we see is, a bunch of themes, if you like, or areas where there are significant differences between young people and others. So they think that wages keeping up with cost of living is a big problem, right? And you can see that young people are significantly more likely to agree strongly with that proposition than the rest of the sample. The same is true about balancing work and life. And I guess what we're trying to do here, because of course, remember, we're trying to bring this back to the gig economy, you can see that thematically a number of these things are kind of connected to the public debate and the regulatory debate that we're having around gig work as kind of being, on the one hand, pretty bad work where the pay's low, the conditions are pretty terrible, but it's also, and this is the publicity that platform companies use, very flexible work that potentially, gives people some options for juggling their work and non-work commitments. So, thematically, there's a relevance here. We're not just putting this up for no reason, but you can see right away that there are these youth and non-youth differences, right? So they differ with respect to wages, with balancing work and life, with access to good, flexible work. As you would expect, there's a big sort of point difference when it comes to the issue of work opportunities for young people. mildly amusingly, there's also a significant difference with respect to work opportunities for older people, but the difference kind of goes the other way. So young people care less about that than the rest of the sample. They care more about racism at work, and they also care significantly more about work opportunities for women, right? So these issues about opportunities to get into work, to kind of find flexible work, they're sort of mindful of these things, and they seem to be more attuned, if you like, to these issues than other members of the population. Thanks, Julia. So that's on the one hand, I guess, evidence that in some ways, you know, young people might be thinking differently about the nature of work in the gig economy. So remember, that's what we're trying to focus on here, is their attitudes, what they think about the nature of the work being provided by platforms sort of as consumers. Potentially going in the other direction is this kind of evidence, which shows that, again, as probably most of us in the room would expect, that young people are more sort of prolific users of platform services than older members of the population. And what we ask about is 6 different kinds of digital platform-based work. And you can see that 2 really dominate to such a large extent that we almost use them now as kind of shorthand for what the gig economy is, even though it's actually kind of quite a bit broader than this. But the top 2, by and large, are about home delivery of food and drinks and taking short trips or journeys like with Uber. Obviously, things are changing quickly. When we fielded this survey just earlier this year, Deliveroo was the example that we used of the first kind of gig work, and you'll know, of course, that they've now decided to pack up their Australian operation, but there are still plenty of other platform companies operating in this space. The point of this slide is just to show you that particularly for those top 2 type of platform services, young people are using these which with much greater prevalence than older members of the population. So in there you can see a distinction both between those that are using these regularly, like at least once a month, and those that are using them on a more sort of occasional basis. So they're participating a lot, if you like, in this gig economy as users. And again, remember, we're trying to emphasise and study that the user side or the consumer side. Now, why that's relevant is because our earlier work, not focusing on youth, but focusing on the more general story, indicated that use is positively associated with attitudes about the nature of gig work. So if you're using these services, you're more likely to think that these services are good. Okay, so it's kind of, that's muddying the water and in a way, I guess, swinging us back the other way from that earlier picture, right, where we see a lot of valid, I think, youth concern about a range of things that are happening in the contemporary workforce. So they're worried about a whole set of issues, more than others, but they're also more prevalent users of these services. And when you then ask them, as these questions do, about their views of the kind of work that's available in the gig economy, you can see here that none of these differences are statistically significant, right? So this is the same kind of a presentation as the slide just 2 ago, where we're asking them whether they agree or disagree with a set of propositions. And we've asked them both, I guess, positively framed and negatively framed sort of sentiment type questions. So are these platforms providing people with the kind of work that's a good starting point for getting into the workforce? So a more upbeat, a more favourable kind of question. We also asked them whether these platforms are providing the kind of work that's more likely to leave workers financially insecure, that's more likely to leave workers vulnerable and open to exploitation. So there's a few things that I want you to notice on this slide. The first is that the youth and non-youth differences there are not significant. Okay, but within, if you just look at the results for young people, you see that there is a bit of a spectrum there of differences, right? So they're certainly likely to agree with the proposition that these platforms are providing work that allows people to have a flexible work schedule, right? So that's in fact the one of the six that they're most likely to agree with. They're much more lukewarm, you might say, tepid, on this idea that this is the kind of work that you can build a career out of. Okay, so they don't really buy that to nearly the same extent, but they don't really stand out, if you like, from the rest of the older population in the strength of their views about these points. So we're kind of seeing very much what David cleverly anticipated, that we've got a very kind of mixed picture here. So this is only our first real attempt to dive into this, and we think there's still quite a lot left to do. Just want to show you one more slide before I wrap up. What we've begun to do is to just, where we think the action is sort of in combining these elements for purposes of essentially statistical description, and seeing what differences kind of emerge from this. So I'm not going to give you anywhere near the full version of this story, but one thing obviously that matters is this combination of age and being a platform user or not. Okay, and this is just a really, and I don't know if this is even the best way of doing it, but this is the way we've tried first of all, just making comparisons using a very simple regression model between essentially 4 groups of people. So at the top you can see the base group, or the reference here, is people that are not young and that are not platform users. And their mean favourability, if you like, around gig work, which is just a summative measure of those previous 6 questions, is a bit over 3, right, on a scale out of 5. And then we ask, well, how do people in the other 3 categories, users who are either not young or young, and non-users, how do they differ? And you can see in the first 2 rows here, so row A, so young people that are not platform users, they're not statistically significantly different in their mean score from the reference group, nor are young people who are platform users, even though their mean score numerically is a little bit higher. But non-young people who are platform users do have significantly more favourable views, right? That's what the last row here shows. So again, we're seeing a picture that's a bit similar to what we described in our earlier paper, where some platform use seems to be associated with more favourable views of the nature of work provided by platforms. It's not entirely clear, and we haven't yet really teased out those differences for young people. So again, there's more work to do. And what we want to do, I guess, is dig into a host of the other variables that are available in this great data set, and look at to what extent they might be associated with both of these things, right? With age and with platform use. Do we see significantly different patterns there? So to just conclude, it's a very mixed picture. We're definitely seeing some evidence of perceived positives around the nature of platform work, sort of, I think, very largely picking up on the messaging of platforms themselves. We've kind of deliberately used some grabs from the, ultra cool advertising these companies are using to promote their products to prospective users. But we also see among young people and others ample kind of cognizance of the problems. We know, and this is reinforcing, that there's this kind of complex interplay going on between people's use and their views. When we started out doing this, we were sort of hoping that we would get to the point where we would have a kind of a solid basis for, developing campaigns, developing kind of counter messaging, if you like, around building a case for better platform work, for improving gig workers' conditions. What our research has sort of been showing is that sort of resistive tendency is very much confounded or offset entirely by just the sheer convenience of using these services. People really seem to like using these services. And as Andy raised with that idea of willful ignorance, kind of we're willing to some extent at least to overlook the bad sides and overlook the harms. What I think we've got here is evidence that youth, like as a category in and of itself, and this won't probably surprise any of you, isn't determinative of attitudes, right? So it's not just that in relation to gig work, okay? So we don't see these really sharp differences in just the raw kind of youth, non-youth comparisons. So we've got to go deeper into this stuff, and we want to, as I said, explore the connections between age, other kinds of attitudes and other kinds of behaviours that we have access to in the data set, ultimately, hoping to get to the point where we can think more clearly about how consumers might facilitate or indeed might impede campaigns for better gig work. So that's where we're at. Thanks a lot.
Questions?
Thanks, Josh. I really enjoyed that. Did you control? I don't want to do that.
As a qualitative researcher.
As a qualitative interviewer, I think it's coming to me. But did you control for their general views, those problems? Did you control for those in the model? Because I wonder how much those general views then might be explaining some of this or not explaining.
Yeah, great question. No, we haven't done that. No, so that's sort of just a standalone. That's just a sort of standalone picture. Nothing, not controlling for anything. Just comparing the mean differences. So, yeah, good point. Yeah, we'll make a note of that. Thanks, Brendan.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
And just thinking about other platforms as well, platforms you asked about, and gig economy platforms. I'm just thinking now
Indeed.
the use of betting platforms, which seem to be ubiquitous,
Right.
investment platforms. And I'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow. Now housing platforms as well, which I think linked in this in really interesting ways. So Snug, for instance,
okay,
which is not part of the gig economy, but it's linked to the gig economy to the extent that it emphasises your ability to access rental accommodation.
Yeah.
I just wondered whether there's something more generic here about people's use of apps and platforms, not just to do with delivery or working with the gig economy, but awareness people are kind of embedded within it in investment, in housing, in work, and so on. I think the use of some of those platforms has to be greater amongst non-youth. It would be
okay.
I don't know if you have it here, but do you have platforms for care workers?
Yes, that's one of the things that's mentioned here. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I just think it's really interesting just in terms of people's engagement with that technology per se, not just in relation to work.
I mean, yeah, I completely believe that's entirely plausible. I guess what we're looking at here is those platforms that provide, on the other side of the transaction, some access to paid work. I don't want to dominate the discussion. What do you think? Yeah.
The thing that concerns me, we're going to talk about it a bit tomorrow, is the means by which a lot of this platform stuff is being exercised, and it's tracking and tracing people in sorts of ways.
Absolutely.
In relation to credit referencing and how it feeds into other forms of inequality, especially access to housing.
Absolutely.
Because with anyway, I'll talk about it tomorrow. I think that they're entangled in ways I don't think we're quite understood.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point.
Oh, no. So I don't have anything to add to that point.
Any more questions?
Only to no one else. So it seems to me like basically, big picture, what they're saying is the gig economy is here. I like using it. I would just like it to be better for workers.
Mm.
We want a better world of work in a general sense.
Yep.
We acknowledge the gig economy isn't good for workers in a general sense.
Yep.
I would still like to have a tie delivered to my house on Thursday evening. I would like that worker to be paid more. That seems to me to be kind of the attitude that prior to the emergence of the gig economy, I had towards like things like pizza delivery,
Right.
taxis. You know, like we talk about how exploiting Uber is and is, of course. The taxi industry was a famously horrible industry to work in, sub-minimum wage, prior to Uber, things like that.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, you know, we have seen the gig economy come in our life as a radical change in how we engage with services.
Indeed.
If you're 19, it's always been there. See what I mean?
I do.
So perhaps part of what's going on here is that they regard it as a normal part of the economy.
Yeah.
In the same way that we regard drinking in a pub served by someone who's very well making less than minimum wage as a normal part of the economy.
Yeah.
They would just like it to be better, as we would like the pub worker. You see what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I do. Yeah, no, and you know, and what we're doing here is sort of really just a survey-based kind of beginning of where we'd really like to go, which is to sort of delve much more into that and to kind of look at, you know, what other actions might people take as consumers to assuage that kind of feeling of awkwardness about the fact that it's bad work, right? Like, right, maybe that's it. Yeah, maybe that's it. Maybe they just, I don't know, go out of their way to be especially nice and friendly to the people that they're interacting with. I don't know, but there's the thing that I guess I didn't. I'm just harking back to the earlier work we'd done. So we had another survey in the field around about 5 years ago, and what we've seen, just fast forwarding now to these data, is that, you know, that on the usage side, it's kind of gone through the roof, right? So that point about normalization and it's everywhere and everybody's using it, so, you know, kind of what's the big deal? That's very much happened. And so for us, that's like, you know, the platforms are winning, I think, essentially, because the tide is sort of sweeping over us as consumers. We've not really shifted the dial when it comes to the depth of our concern about the work, right? And so I guess we were hoping that we might see, you know, a bit of a bigger spike, especially coming off COVID, where we kind of had this narrative that these are essential workers and, you know, they're doing fantastic things for us while we're in lockdown. So we just don't kind of see that to the same extent. And I guess we read that in a slightly, what would just, I don't know, maybe a slightly dispiriting way, because, you know, the increase, the surge in usage is evident, but a comparable shift in terms of people's awareness of the badder points of the work is kind of not there to nearly the same extent in the data that we've got. So
we were also a bit surprised because there's been quite a lot of public discussion about PWs.
Can't hear you on Zoom, Andy.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I suppose we were kind of expecting the picture to be a little bit different because there's been a lot of public debate around gig work. So PW's been campaigning heavily around it. It was in a short spate. It was like 5 riders died in road accidents. It was publicity around that.
Absolutely.
Labour Party's taken it to the election as part of their platform on industrial relations reform. So I suppose, you know, I was expecting to be seen as a more contentious issue. So, so I'm, you know, so I think what you're saying is right.
Yeah.
More. I also, you know, 5 years ago, I wasn't so surprised that people didn't understand what the work involves and how much good or bad the work is. But I almost was expecting people to be more now. If they are, they're certainly going to see. Well, the picture is a mix, so they're concerned with some issues and less concerned with others.
Well, they're voting with their feet and becoming users despite the known misgivings, yeah?
That's the upshot.
Thanks so much. That was really interesting. Just bouncing off the discussion that we've had so far, and thinking about, I suppose, the reading of this as young people want to keep using these services and accept them as part of the economy, but we want potentially better conditions. I'm wondering, is there any work, or have you asked any questions around consumers' willingness to pay? Because I think it really kind of comes down to that. I think that any kind of conditional wage increase is very likely to be passed on to consumers, and I'm wondering if people are using these platforms would there potentially be enough solidarity to be willing to pay a bit more for these services? Would that be a really hard barrier? Do you have any sense of that?
My sense of that is there's generally not a great willingness to pay much more. And there's not been much work done. I know of one paper only looking at that in relation to gig work. There has been other research done on, the ways in which, consumers might be willing to pay more for certain services. And there generally is some positive increment, but it's small.
The study show we'll pay more tax theoretically if climate change when it becomes a political issue.
Later. Yeah.
Sorry to ask another question, just to think through spark lots of ideas. I wonder if the error that we're making is just focusing on the gig economy. I mean, this seems to me to be part and parcel of what breakfast is called, volunteer capital, and essentially a whole series of platforms that developed as just one example of the owners of large-scale corporations who are making a wholesale change in the way the economy is organised in terms of the extraction of essentially rents from the ownership of assets. And what is so striking, in a sense, I wasn't thinking about it when I asked the question. All of these platforms are the same. In a sense, they all do the same thing. They bring people together within a market, consumers, producers, and essentially they make their money from extracting and selling from the processes.
Correct.
But it seems to me to be generic, and it's not, in this instance we're talking about work and services, but it applies to many other things we're talking about now, and actually maybe a focus on the problems of the technology for volunteer capitalism might be basically need to go rather than just focus on the process. Seems to be just one aspect.
Yeah, fantastic point. Yeah.
I just wanted to set this up to what Dave said. And just thinking about the young people perspective, like the kind of tension between it. I think the young people, like the gig economy seems like the industry, the opportunity to the level market. Like it's like that easy backup for Like and so that's perhaps the tension for them. Like they use it and they want better of it, but it's not be a fallback for them.
Yeah, but I understand your point, but I guess just rewinding to that idea, and I don't know, we're not totally sure whether that idea that we floated of sort of intra-generational sort of solidarity has any real legs. I'm kind of interested in talking to people about that, but if in the situation that you've described there, Brendan, you could imagine a way in which that sentiment sort of might be triggered because young people are using these services, buying the services, ordering the meals, ordering the rides, and seeing that it's also young people on the other end who are kind of delivering these services. Again, I guess we started with that premise that might, then lend itself to more critical views of the nature of the work. Once you've used it and you've seen what it's like and you've maybe done the work yourself, you've talked to your mates.
No, I take your point. I just want to say two things from that argument. I wonder about the class and race politics about the consumers versus the doers and you separate yourself from. I might workers, so I wonder about that. And the material need, like so the services that young people need are to feed themselves and to get them to make money. And so
and this is just how you do those things, yeah?
I'm just saying these things.
Yeah.
Obviously like a really generative paper, and I was going to speak to the paper, the material need for these services, and what is the alternative?
Yeah.
People when this is what they're offered, and they see other young people work in this space, and they maybe like myself are receiving sponsored content on their social media saying this is an empowered young person working for a particular app or platform or upgrading their skills in care work or adapting their social work degree to the climate as a side hustle to get where they need to go.
Yeah. That's right.
And so they're seeing that kind of content, or they're hearing only positive stories from the person that's driving their from one place to the other. And if that's the only way that you're appreciating the service or getting the service, or they have the occasional shitty cold pizza delivered to them, then they might read and hear things in the news and be like, that's terrible. But what is the alternative when they don't know anything else?
Yeah.
And especially when they are now afforded choice, to say, to tip their rider or their server
Yep.
or whatever it is. You know, I would generalize that because people are not so big.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose the context though is that we also know that people recognise that there's a lot of problems in the labour market. So people, including young people, recognise that there's a lot of problems in the labour market. So the fact that they're just using the platforms does not necessarily mean they can't see what's problematic. And I mean, I think your point is very valid.
Yeah.
Clearly, platforms are extremely savvy and successful in the market and portray things in the way you're describing. So yes, I mean, it's unlikely unless they're really interested or active or aware of workers' rights and stuff like that they have hugely aware. So I think we're trying to dig into that a bit more.
Yeah.
I mean, there's studies from the US. So gig workers do use the example of sharing positive stories for riders. There's also this interesting work that shows when platforms tweak the pay rates, Uber drivers were getting to, so they switched platforms. So they're luring customers to ride with Lyft. So it's not that they are like uncritical people for the platform. So that there's a level of advocacy from us.
But I was just going to say, I'm very sympathetic to that point about like for now many of these services, there is no alternative. I mean, going to the earlier point about the business model, that's kind of how they work, right? You come in, undercut the competition, drive them out of business, and then acquire a monopoly. Huh?
Yeah, you're switching between.
Yeah.
You're still staying.
Yeah. Yeah.
The alternative platform is a little bit better.
Yeah, I mean, we started. One of the things we did early on was look at a few of the alternatives to Uber, right, in the ride sort of hailing space, and like a lot of those businesses have since gone to the wall. They just couldn't sustain it in a climate where Uber has all the users on its books. So yeah, I don't know, but I am sympathetic to that point that if you're young and kind of using these services, then it's not easy to just find some readily accessible, comparably priced alternative. Yeah.
I suppose it's one way in terms of segueing into tomorrow.
Uh-huh.
And I know this isn't in your data, but Mike's got a last question now. But I might speculate a little bit. Can you go back to slide to show the names of the platforms? I mean, I mentioned that they're great at designing. Yeah. And they're great at marketing, but they're actually not very good at capitalism, are they? Because they're not really making any money. And like, they just have to make profit. Deliveroo is disappearing. Like, I mean, are they that exploitative with workers and we're so willing not to pay anything? What's going to happen here? Because they seem to be all propped up by venture capitalism and they're not actually profitable.
I don't know what the future of that is, but I think that's a fair assessment of where things are at. Yeah, well, I mean, they all operate in the hope of acquiring that monopoly position, at which point they will then be able to be profitable, right? But that competition is more or less advanced in different sectors of this gig economy. I don't know. I mean, there's a kind of another story there to it, I think, around, what's happening with all this data that they're capturing about our lives. And I think that links in, and I don't, have a kind of a grand theory of how we should think about all that. But, part of what they're doing is running at a loss, apparently, on the back of all this venture capital, but at the same time learning enormous amounts about how we move around and, what we want to buy and the things that we'll click on and whether we're willing to pay more. And I kind of feels at times like that the access to that information might be more advantageous in the long run than a quick short-term profit. No worries.
Okay, thanks, Josh and Andy.
Thank you.